The termination of an offspring ought to transport a household unified. But for Kody Brown, Garrison's burial became the concluding confirmation in the conclusion of his relationship with his surviving offspring. What occurred at those memorial occasions was so astonishing, so completely insensitive, that it severed the final delicate connections associating this guardian to the offspring who previously examined up to him. Sources proximate to the Brown household disclose that Kody's conduct during Garrison's memorial occasions departed his offspring completely astonished. We're discussing about a man who had currently misplaced the respect of most of his 18 offspring, but somehow succeeded to cause circumstances even more severe during the most sacred and painful instance of their existences. The specifications that are emerging present a representation of a guardian so consumed with his own sorrow exhibition that he disregarded he wasn't the only one experiencing grief. Internal sources communicate that Kody managed the memorial like it was his personal attention instance. While his offspring were attempting to process the devastating misplacement of their sibling, their guardian was allegedly more concentrated on how he manifested to others than maintaining his grieving household. Internal sources propose he created responses and determinations that departed his offspring, experiencing like their suffering didn't signify compared to his own dramatic exhibition of sorrow. The most disappointing portion? This wasn't just any burial. This was Garrison's memorial. A young man who had currently been separated from his guardian, who had terminated without that relationship being repaired. You'd contemplate that actuality would humble any guardian, would cause them comprehend how precious and delicate these household associations genuinely are. But apparently not Kody Brown. What's emerging from household internal sources is that Kody's conduct was so egregious that offspring who had been maintaining on by a connection who might have provided him one more opportunity, traversed away completely. We're discussing about offspring who had currently observed their guardian systematically destroy relationships with their mothers, who had perceived him perform preferences and control circumstances for years, but somehow they still possessed a minimal portion of anticipation departed until those memorial occasions. The particular incidents that developed have been maintained predominantly private, out of respect for Garrison's recollection, but the consequences communicates comprehensively. When your own offspring publicly announce they haven't perceived you since their sibling's burial, when they're requesting outsiders on social platforms not to evaluate them to you, that communicates you everything you require to understand about how severely you experience difficulty up. And here's the most devastating portion of all this catastrophe. This wasn't some arbitrary household conflict or characteristic Brown household disorder. This was a guardian failing his offspring during the most severe instance of their existences when they required him most. When sorrow ought to have transported them unified, Kody Brown discovered a manner to cause it all about himself. But that was just the commencement of how spectacularly this man would continue to fail his surviving offspring. The evidence of just how severely Kody destroyed circumstances at Garrison's memorial arrived in the most public and disappointing manner conceivable. His own offspring commenced creating declarations that no guardian ought to ever have to perceive. Kody and Kody Brown didn't just silently distance themselves from their guardian. They transformed public with announcements that ought to cause any guardian's circulation operate cold. Both offspring have declared publicly and unequivocally that they haven't perceived their guardian since Garrison's burial. Contemplate about that for an instant. The final duration these offspring perceived their guardian was at their sibling's interment. The final recollection they possess of being in the identical space as the man who developed them was during the most distressing day of their existences. And apparently, whatever occurred during those occasions was so terrible that they determined correct then and there that they were concluded. This isn't some temporary subsiding off period we're discussing about here. This isn't offspring being dramatic or transforming through a rebellious stage. These are young, mature individuals who created a conscious determination to completely sever interaction with their guardian, immediately pursuing their siblings' termination. The timing communicates you everything you require to understand about how spectacularly Kody failed during what ought to have been an instance of household unity. Mykelti's circumstance is specifically disappointing because she had been one of the limited offspring still preserving some variety of relationship with her guardian. She wasn't completely separated like some of her siblings. She was still discussing to him, still providing him opportunities, still anticipating that perhaps he could transform and be the guardian she required him to be. But whatever occurred at those memorial occasions was apparently her separating location. And then there's the devastating actuality that these offspring are currently processing their sorrow without any assistance from their surviving guardian. They're experiencing with the misplacement of their sibling, while simultaneously grieving the complete deterioration of their relationship with their guardian. It's trauma on summit of trauma, and it's all because Kody couldn't succeed to conduct appropriately during the most significant instance when his household required him. Sources proximate to the household propose that other siblings are also preserving their separation. But Paedon and Mykelti are the ones who have been most communicative about their determination. The circumstance that they're willing to create these declarations publicly displays just how far beyond repair these relationships have become. When you're willing to communicate the environment that you haven't perceived your guardian since your sibling's burial, that's not a communication for focus. That's a declaration of finality. The most tragic portion: this was completely preventable. All Kody had to accomplish was display up for his offspring during the most severe instance of their existences. Rather, he succeeded to cause their sorrow even more severe. But the public rejection was just commencing advancement. If you desire to comprehend just how completely Kody Brown has failed as a guardian, examine no further than his offspring, Paedon's frantic appeal on TikTok. This young man was so horrified by the concept of being evaluated to his guardian that he literally requested his supporters to halt creating the association. When your own offspring is publicly requesting outsiders not to relate them with you, that's not just household conflict. That's complete parental failure. Paedon didn't just informally mention that he didn't desire to be like his guardian. He actively appealed with individuals to halt evaluating him to that individual. Not even my guardian or my father, just that individual. The emotional separation in those two statements declares everything about how this young man currently observes the individual who developed him. Kody has become so harmful in his offspring's perception that Paedon can't even transport himself to recognize the household association, contemplate about what it acquires for someone to receive to that location. This isn't a teenager possessing an outburst, or a young, mature individual transforming through a rebellious stage. This is a developed man who has observed his guardian's conduct for years, determined he desires completely nothing to accomplish with that inheritance. He's so concerned about individuals perceiving similarities between them that he's willing to publicly distance himself in the most definitive manner conceivable. The timing of this TikTok appeal is specifically devastating. This arrived following Garrison's burial, following whatever occurred at those memorial occasions that conclusively separated Paedon's final connection of association to his guardian. He transformed from someone who was still engaging with Kody, still portion of the household interaction, to someone actively rejecting any relation with the Brown patriarch. What causes this even more disappointing is that Pedon is essentially abandoning himself emotionally. He's selecting to be without a guardian rather than preserve any association to Kody. When an offspring creates that selection, when they determine that possessing no guardian is superior than possessing the guardian they've possessed, that communicates you everything about how harmful that relationship had become. And it's not like Pedon is attempting to be cruel or dramatic. Sources propose he's merely safeguarding his own mental health and future relationships. He's observed what occurs to individuals who remain in Kody's sphere too extended. He's perceived the control, the preference, the emotional activities, and he's determined he desires no portion of it, even if it signifies publicly rejecting his own guardian. The most devastating portion, Kody doesn't appear to comprehend the significance of what his offspring accomplished. While Pedon is frantically attempting to divide himself from his guardian's reputation, Kody continues operating like nothing has transformed. He's still performing the casualty, still performing like he's the one who's been incorrect by his ungrateful offspring. But Pedon's public rejection was nothing evaluated to what was about to be disclosed on national programming. Then arrived the instance that ought to have been Kody's restoration narrative, but rather became the most pathetic exhibition of fabricated responsibility we've ever perceived on actuality programming. Episode 7 of Special Forces displayed Kody's interrogation with the directing personnel, where he separated down, expressing emotional distress about being a failed partner and guardian. For a brief instance, the audience almost experienced sympathy for this man as he appeared to acquire obligation for destroying his household. Almost. The directing personnel didn't restrain back as they interrogated him about his relationships with his offspring and previous spouses. They labeled him out for being dominating, for demanding that everyone perform to his melody, for only being concerned about his household as extended as they concurred with everything he accepted. And for once in his existence, Kody appeared to acknowledge they were correct. He recognized that he ought to have possessed stronger relationships with his offspring. He asserted he was prepared to declare he'd been incorrect. My failures were because I didn't understand about being favorable guardian and partner. He expressed emotional distress to the military personnel. I genuinely believed I misinterpreted that, and I accomplished it incorrect in so numerous manners. The emotional displays flowed as he acknowledged to being resistant to acquiring possession because he detested being reproached for anything. It was supposedly his instance of advancement, his recognition that all the responsibilities were his and his alone. But here's the circumstance about Kody Brown that causes this complete exhibition so repulsive. This man is a master controller who understands precisely what to communicate when the recording devices are operating. He's been performing the casualty in the reformed individual for over a period on Sister Wives. He understands how to express emotional distress on demand, how to communicate the statements individuals desire to perceive, how to cause himself resemble he's developing and transforming. The most revealing portion of his Special Forces deterioration, none of his offspring even understood he was proceeding on the program. He didn't experience difficulty to communicate Pedon, Mykelti, or any of his other offspring that he was about to proceed on national programming to examine their relationship. That correct there communicates you everything about how genuine his remorse genuinely was. If he was genuinely attempting to reconstruct connections with his offspring, wouldn't he at minimum provide them an advance notification? And the timing causes it even more suspicious. This was recorded in June, periods following Garrison's burial, periods following he'd currently misplaced interaction with most of his surviving offspring. So, either he was completely unconscious about how severely he'd destroyed circumstances, or he was utilizing his offspring's termination and his household's suffering as content for an actuality program. Either alternative is completely repulsive. But the genuine evaluation of whether Kody had genuinely transformed would arrive in how his offspring responded to perceiving their guardian's supposed advancement. Mykelti's response to observing her guardian's deterioration on special forces was completely disappointing and disclosed just how profound the damage genuinely proceeds. During her Patreon observation along, she possessed an emotional response that displayed the complicated sentiments so numerous of Kody's offspring are experiencing. She acknowledged to possessing emotional displays while observing the broadcast and declared she'd re-observed it multiple periods, still experiencing difficulty with conflicting feelings about what she perceived. I both appreciate and don't appreciate what my guardian communicated in this segment, Mykelti disclosed to her supporters. He possesses substantial responsibility, and it's revitalizing. It is revitalizing to perceive Special Forces has accomplished something favorable for him. But here's what causes this so tragic. This was apparently the initial duration Mykelti had ever perceived her guardian acquired genuine obligation for his failures. Contemplate about that. She's his offspring, and she had to observe him on an actuality programming program to conclusively perceive him, acknowledge he'd been incorrect. The most devastating portion of Mykelti's response was how surprised she appeared by her guardian's statements. This was all series new information to her. She'd never perceived him recognize that he'd failed as a guardian. She'd never perceived him acknowledge that his relationships with his offspring were separated because of his own activities. Her own guardian had to proceed on national programming and be interrogated by military personnel before he could communicate the statements his offspring required to perceive. But Mykelti isn't naive about her guardian's configuration of conduct. Even while recognizing that his statements experienced revitalizing, she was distinctly skeptical about whether this represented genuine transformation or just another one of his renowned exhibitions. And her supporters acquired up on that skepticism immediately, requesting the difficult inquiries that were on everyone's perceptions. The most significant inquiry arrived from her supporters. Has Kody transformed, though? Did you perceive a transformation in him when he returned from this? This wasn't just curiosity about actuality programming conflict. This was Mykelti's community attempting to assist her process, whether her guardian's program deterioration signified anything for their genuine relationship. Mykelti's partner Tony provided some understanding, disclosing that Kody did reach out to Mykelti soon following recording Special Forces. Apparently, she was presumably one of the initial offspring he interacted, which creates perception since they'd preserved more interaction than his other offspring. But even that outreach was revealing. Tony mentioned that Kody has reached out multiple periods, but that Mykelti wasn't consistently in a position to possess genuine telephone discussions with him. The circumstance that their relationship condition is characterized as pending declares everything. Even his most accessible offspring, the one who's been most willing to provide him opportunities, still can't comprehensively commit to reconstructing their relationship. But the genuine inquiry everyone desired responded was whether this apparent transformation was reaching his other offspring. Here's where Kody's supposed conversion following Special Forces discloses itself to be nothing more than selective damage domination. While he was rapid to reach out to Mykelti, the offspring who had preserved the most interaction with him, he apparently couldn't be. Experienced difficulty to extend that identical attempt to all of his offspring, and the ones he disregarded, they're still publicly declaring they haven't perceived from him since Garrison's burial. Tony disclosed, during Mykelti's observation along, that Kody reached out to her genuinely soon following recording Special Forces, and that he'd interacted her multiple periods since then. But when supporters requested about his outreach to Mykelti's siblings, Tony was very cautious to communicate they wouldn't communicate on what Kody's relationship was like with any of her siblings and sisters. Translation: commercial as standard for everyone else. The configuration here is completely maddening and displays that Kody acquired completely nothing from his programmed deterioration. He's still performing preferences, still acquiring the effortless direction, still preventing the difficult discussions with the offspring who require the most repair labor. Mykelti was currently one of the limited offspring, still discussing to him occasionally, so reaching out to her required minimal attempt and arrived with the most reduced risk of rejection. But what about Pedon, who was so frantic to distance himself from his guardian that he requested TikTok supporters to halt evaluating them, radio quietness? What about the other offspring who severed interaction following the memorial occasions? Apparently, they didn't warrant the identical post-Special Forces outreach that Mykelti received. It's the identical preference and emotional laziness that received Kody into this difficulty in the initial position. Sources propose that if Kody had genuinely transformed, if his Special Forces experience had genuinely converted him, he would have reached out to every individual one of his offspring. He would have commenced with the ones who required the most restoration, not the one who was currently most probable to respond positively. But that's not what occurred, because Kody's interpretation of transformation is consistently about causing himself experience superior, not genuinely accomplishing the difficult labor of repairing relationships. The circumstance that Pedon is still declaring he hasn't discussed to his guardian communicates us everything we require to understand about how comprehensive Kody's post-Special Forces conversion genuinely was. Mykelti even mentioned recently that she communicated her guardian he would require to repair his relationship, particularly with Truly and Isabel, before she could be comprehensively receptive to reconstructing their relationship. But apparently Kody's concept of transformation doesn't extend to accomplishing the difficult labor with the offspring who require more attempt. But his selective outreach wasn't the only region where Kody's supposed conversion fell abbreviated. Perhaps the most revealing demonstration of Kody's complete emotional disconnection arrived in what he didn't accomplish during one of his household's most content instances. While he was off recording Special Forces and possessing his programmed deterioration about being a failed guardian, his offspring, Madison, was providing birth to her fourth offspring. And apparently congratulating his offspring on her new infant wasn't significant enough to create it onto Kody's priority inventory. Madison possessed her newborn just a couple of periods before Kody transformed to record Special Forces. Sources propose that Kody definitely perceived about the birth through the household communication network, and he certainly could have discovered out by merely accessing onto the internet. But internal sources communicate that he never reached out to Madison to congratulate her on the arrival of her new infant. Permit that absorb for an instance. His offspring possessed an offspring, and he couldn't be experienced. Difficulty to transmit even a straightforward congratulations communication. This is specifically devastating when you consider the timing in Madison's relationship condition with her guardian. On Sister Wives, Janelle disclosed that it had been 2 or 3 years since Madison had even communicated to Kody. So, here was a flawless opportunity for him to extend a conciliation offer, to display that he was concerned about his offspring's contentment, to demonstrate that becoming a grandfather again signified something to him. Rather, nothing. But here's what causes this even more infuriating. On the program, Kody has particularly singled out Madison as being the leader of the household speculation mechanism. He's reproached her for generating up conflict and influencing other household members against him. So, when she possessed a significant existence occasion, when she experienced one of the most beautiful instances an individual can possess, his response was to continue providing her the cold treatment. The difference is completely astonishing. This is the identical man who transformed on Special Forces, expressing emotional distress about how he'd failed as a guardian, acknowledging that he ought to have possessed stronger relationships with his offspring, asserting he was prepared to accomplish superior. But when presented with a genuine opportunity to display development to reach out to an offspring he'd been separated from, he accomplished completely nothing. Meanwhile, Madison designated her new infant, Amelia Estelle, with the center designation selected to honor Garrison. She's processing the content of new existence while grieving the misplacement of her sibling, and her own guardian can't even recognize either of these massive emotional experiences she's transforming through. This wasn't an oversight or a occupied arrangement disagreement. This was a conscious selection that discloses everything about Kody's priorities and his interpretation of being a transformed man. One of the most disappointing circumstances Mykelti disclosed during her emotional observation along was how Kody continues to accumulate all of his offspring unified as one unit. Even when examining his failures as a guardian, she theorizes he accomplishes this to safeguard individual offspring from receiving singled out, but it genuinely discloses something much more threatening about how he observes his relationships with his offspring. He doesn't perceive them as individuals with unique requirements and alternative levels of relationship repair required. This accumulating approach is traditional Kody Brown control disguised as safeguarding. By discussing about his offspring as a collective assembly, he prevents acquiring obligation for the particular manners he's failed each individual offspring. He doesn't have to recognize that his relationship with Padon requires alternative repair labor than his relationship with Mykelti. He doesn't have to confront the actuality that some of his offspring require more attempt and responsibility than others. Mykelti desires her. Guardian wouldn't utilize this approach because it displays he's still not willing to accomplish the individual labor that genuine relationships require. Each of his offspring has been damaged in alternative manners. Some have been disregarded. Others have been controlled. Some have been utilized as instruments against their mothers. But Kody's lazy method manages all of these alternative relationship failures as if they're the identical difficulty with the identical resolution. The preference that's consistently characterized Kody's parenting manner is still energetic and functional, just contained alternatively currently. He reached out to Mykelti following Special Forces, but apparently not to Padon or Madison or the other offspring who severed interaction following Garrison's memorial. He's still acquiring the effortless direction with the offspring who require less attempt, while disregarding the ones who require the most restoration. But perhaps the most revealing demonstration of his continued preference is how he's managing the offspring who are still publicly maintaining him. Logan has been responding on Instagram submissions about Special Forces, promoting his guardian up and displaying public assistance. And you can guarantee that Kody is consuming up that confirmation while completely disregarding the offspring who are experiencing difficulty with his conduct. This selective focus is precisely the identical configuration that destroyed his matrimonies and separated most of his offspring in the initial position. He gravitates toward the relationships that cause him experience favorable about himself, while preventing the ones that require him to confront troubled realities about his conduct. It's emotional laziness, disguised as safeguarding, and it displays that his special forces' deterioration was just another exhibition. The circumstance that he's still operating this manner, even following publicly acknowledging he'd failed as a guardian, displays just how profound his malfunction genuinely operates. In the center of all this household devastation, there's one Brown offspring who's been publicly maintaining his guardian, and it's generating an even more complicated interaction within this separated household. Logan Brown has been responding on Instagram submissions about special forces, promoting up his guardian and displaying public assistance during what ought to be Kody's most reduced instance. And you can guarantee that Kody is adhering to that confirmation like an existence preservation device, while completely disregarding the offspring who are experiencing drowning in their suffering. Logan's assistance is specifically significant because he's one of the previous offspring who has generally remained out of the public household conflict. He's been more private about his relationship with his guardian, evaluated to some of his siblings who have been very communicative about their separation. So, when he does communicate up publicly to maintain Kody, it transports significance and provides his guardian something to indicate to as evidence that not all of his offspring have abandoned him. But here's what causes this assistance so problematic in the context of everything else that's occurring. While Logan is publicly supporting his guardian on social platforms, Paydon is requesting individuals not to evaluate him to that individual, and Mykelti is processing complicated sentiments about whether her guardian has genuinely transformed. The difference is stark and displays just how alternatively Kody's various offspring are managing with the household deterioration. Sources proximate to the household propose that Logan's public assistance is precisely the variety of confirmation that permits Kody to prevent confronting the comprehensive scope of his failures. Rather of concentrating on the offspring who frantically require repair labor in their relationships, Kody can indicate to Logan's responses and persuade himself that he's not as severe a guardian as everyone declares. It's the flawless excuse to prevent accomplishing the difficult labor with the offspring who require more attempt. The timing of Logan's assistance is also revealing. While other offspring were severing interaction following Garrison's memorial, Logan was preserving sufficient of a relationship with his guardian to experience comfortable publicly supporting him. This proposes that Logan either wasn't present for whatever occurred at those memorial occasions, or he possesses a very alternative viewpoint on his guardian's conduct than his siblings accomplish. But the most concerning aspect of this interaction is how it's generating separation among the Brown offspring themselves. When one sibling is publicly maintaining the guardian that other siblings are attempting to distance themselves from, it generates additional pressure and capability disagreement within a currently traumatized household system. And all of this transports us to the most troubling aspect of this complete circumstance. And here we arrive at the most disturbing aspect of this complete tragic narrative. Kody Brown is a man who misplaced one offspring to termination and appears completely unaffected by the circumstance that he's actively misplacing the remainder of his offspring to his own conduct. Contemplate about that for an instance. Any standard guardian who had just interred an offspring would be frantically adhering to their surviving offspring, would be accomplishing everything in their authority to strengthen those precious relationships. But not Kody. Rather of Garrison's termination performing as a consciousness communication about how delicate and significant household relationships are, Kody somehow succeeded to utilize his offspring's memorial occasions to drive away even more of his offspring. The man who ought to have been humbled by sorrow, who ought to have been motivated to repair every conceivable relationship, while there was still duration, rather conducted so severely that his surviving offspring determined they were concluded with him permanently. What variety of individual accomplishes that? What variety of guardian observes his offspring sever interaction one by one and doesn't appear concerned sufficient to accomplish the genuine labor required to repair circumstances? We're discussing about a man whose own offspring publicly requested outsiders not to evaluate him to his guardian, and Kody's response has been to continue operating like nothing has transformed. The most troubling portion is how unaffected he appears by all of this. While his offspring are processing their sorrow without any assistance from their surviving guardian, while they're creating public declarations about not desiring to be related with him, Kody continues performing the casualty and concentrating on the limited portions of confirmation he can still receive. He's more concerned with how he resembles on actuality programming than with the circumstance that he's systematically destroyed his relationships with the individuals who ought to signify most. Sources propose that a standard guardian in this circumstance would be in concern mode, would be accomplishing everything conceivable to reconstruct these relationships before it's too delayed. But Kody's interpretation of transformation involves expressing emotional distress on recording device for military personnel while continuing the identical configurations of preference and emotional laziness that received him into this difficulty in the initial position. The catastrophe is that Garrison's termination ought to have been the instance that transported this household unified. The occasion that reminded everyone how precious and delicate these relationships genuinely are. Rather, it became the concluding separating location that severed whatever associations were still maintaining by a connection. And the most disappointing portion, Kody doesn't appear to comprehend that when you misplace an offspring, the suitable response is to maintain your surviving offspring proximate, not to drive them further away through your own selfish conduct. What's your acquisition on Kody's conduct following Garrison's termination? Can a guardian ever return from driving his offspring away during their most dark instance? Submit your considerations below. Impact that appreciation mechanism and cause certain you're registered because the Brown household conflict is far from completed and you won't desire to overlook what's approaching next.